Okay, let's talk about the preferences we want to set up for our sessions. I'm going to load up the preferences by hitting Command comma, and I'm going to go to the audio tab. But before I even do that, I'm going to go to the look and feel tab. And the section's pretty cool. You can pick a bunch of different themes for live. I like the mid-dark theme personally, but you got a lot to choose from. You can also change the zoom of your display. So if you got a big TV or a small monitor or whatever, you can fit things as you need. That's really, really handy for, especially when you're recording far away from the screen. But for our recordings, a lot of what we need to set up is in the audio tab. The audio tab is where we're going to dictate a few important things. The most important is where we're setting up our inputs and our outputs from. So the audio input device and audio output device refers to where your microphone is plugged into and where the audio gets routed out from. I'm using an Apogee Duet. So I want the Duet to be my input device. That's where the microphone goes. And I want it to be the output device. So let's go ahead and switch that for the sake of this recording. Something else you can do, especially if you have an audio interface that has like a lot of inputs and outputs, go into your input configuration, and if you had like 10 inputs here, you can disable the ones that you're not using. And you want to do that because if you have these things active, even if you're not using them, they're going to take some of your computer power. So something to think about if you're using an interface that has more than 2 inputs. The other thing we want to talk about is latency. So latency down here is referring to our buffer size. The buffer size dictates how much delay we're going to hear between talking into the microphone and hearing it through effects and back into our ears. A large buffer makes it almost impossible to record and monitor yourself within the software. Now, if you have direct monitoring on your interface, that means you can hear yourself as soon as you speak into the mic. You get a copy of the audio signal from the mic straight back to your headphones from the interface. But a lot of times you want to monitor in Ableton software. For example, if you want to use auto-tune, you need your voice to go into the mic, into Ableton, process, and then back out through your audio interface and into your headphones. And this buffer size dictates how fast your voice can go through Ableton, process, and then come back out. So for using something, again, like auto-tune, you need it to be really, really quick. If you hear a delay in your voice, it's going to be really, really hard to record. So that's what we're setting up here. These new M1 MacBooks are pretty quick, so I can usually get away with the smallest buffer size, 32 samples, and you'll see that that gives us a latency of about 5 milliseconds. I find that like anything under 10 milliseconds is usually quick enough for you to be able to record. The only thing with this is if your computer is slow, setting this buffer size really small is going to make your computer start to struggle to keep up. So if you set it all the way down to 32 and you start to hear hiccups and pops while you're recording, raise things up a bit. Unfortunately, that just means your computer can't keep up with what's going on. Okay, so we've set up the buffer settings the way we need. We got our inputs and outputs set up. I also want to talk about warping. So warping is this really cool thing that Ableton can do. It does it better than any piece of software. But the problem is it can be really, really aggressive if it's not what you need it to do. When we're recording vocals, we don't really need to warp for the most part. It's very rare that I have to warp things for a vocal recording session. But the problem is there's a setting in Live that will take big files and automatically try to warp them when you import them. So if you load in a beat, it'll start to try to warp that beat, and it may not do a great job at doing that. So we want to prevent that from happening altogether. So in this auto warp long samples section, you want to make sure this is set to off. One other thing I'll talk about really quickly for setup is this metronome and pre-roll section over here. So this is our metronome. When you're making beats, it's really handy to hear your click. But more importantly, when you click this little arrow next to it, you get a counting section. And this dictates how much lead-in time you get before recording starts in Live. So if you have to walk away from your computer to get to your microphone and it takes a second, it might make sense to lead your count in a bit larger to something like 4 bars. Usually I'll keep it to 1 bars, and when we start to record a verse, you'll get to see what that looks like. But that's it when it comes down to the basic setup for Live. Once you do this the first time, you won't have to do it again. But these are really, really important settings to consider. One last thing I'll also show you before I forget. If you go to options here, you have the option of using reduced latency while monitoring. If you're having issues with monitoring, sometimes this setting can help, but it can also mess up the timing of your recording. So I only use it on systems where I really have to. Sometimes I'll use it for like live stream scenarios, but for the most part, I'm able to get really good buffer sizes without relying on the setting. So don't enable it unless you have to.